All right, class, settle in. Have you ever really looked at a map of the United States and thought, wait, how did it get that exact shape? It's not as simple as you might think. It's an incredible story of, honestly, sheer luck, a ton of ambition, and some huge geopolitical gambles. These gambles are what turned a tiny strip of colonies into a massive coast-to-coast superpower. So, let's dig in and see how that map was really drawn.
You know, the story of America doesn't really start with a bang. It starts with a collective shrug from the rest of the world. Seriously. For more than 100 years after Europeans first arrived, North America was seen as, well, just a giant, inconvenient roadblock. It was just in the way of the real prize, all the riches of Asia.
So, picture this. After Columbus's voyages, you have the big maritime powers of the day, right? Spain and Portugal. They were absolutely laser-focused on two things, the gold and silver in Central and South America and the super lucrative spice trade in the East. North America, with its thick forests and, no obvious gold lying around, it just wasn't even on their radar.
I mean, just look at this contrast. All the money, all the energy, it was all being poured into conquering the Aztec and Inca empires down south. The Spanish did send one expedition up north in 1539. They looked around, found no gold, and basically declared the entire continent useless lands. Can you imagine just writing off a whole continent like that?
But then, in the 1600s, something starts to shift. A different kind of European power, England, starts looking at these so-called useless lands and sees a different kind of value. Not gold, no, but land itself. Land for settlement, a chance to build a whole new society from the ground up.
And you can see on this timeline, it was a slow but steady creep of English settlements all down the East Coast. As that colonial population grew and grew to over 1 million people, a collision course with France, who claimed pretty much the entire interior of the continent, well, that became inevitable. This wasn't just a little border dispute, oh no. This was the opening shot of a war that would decide who controlled North America.
And the result? It was a total, complete British victory. France was, for all intents and purposes, kicked off the continent. Look at this new map. I mean, that is a massive shift in power. But here's the kicker. That victory came with a colossal price tag.
So here's the crucial point. Britain was flat broke. To pay off its massive war debts, it turned to the very colonies it had just defended. And that decision, the one to slap on new taxes without giving the colonists any say in the matter, well, that's what lit the fuse that would eventually explode into the American Revolution. Okay, so after the Revolution, the new United States is this fragile little nation, basically just clinging to the Atlantic coast. But way over in Europe, the ambitions of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte, were about to give America an opportunity that would change its destiny forever.
So Napoleon's now in charge of France, and he had just gotten the massive Louisiana territory back from Spain. For the young U.S., this was a total nightmare scenario. Their whole Western economy depended on floating goods down the Mississippi River. And now the most powerful dude in Europe controlled its mouth. It was an economic chokehold, plain and simple.
So the Americans sent a couple of guys over to France with a simple request. Can we please just buy the city of New Orleans? That's all they wanted. But Napoleon, who desperately needed cash for his upcoming war with Britain and probably realized how hard it would be to defend that huge territory, he made a stunning counteroffer. He told them, forget New Orleans. Why don't you buy the whole thing?
For just $15 million, which works out to about 4 cents an acre, Napoleon sold the entire Louisiana territory to the United States.
I mean, come on, that was without a doubt the greatest real estate deal in history. Overnight, the nation's potential was completely transformed. The dream of a country that spanned the whole continent, that wasn't a fantasy anymore. The floodgates for westward expansion were just blown wide open.
The Louisiana Purchase lit a fire under the country. This idea of a nation stretching from sea to shining sea became a national obsession. It was a concept that people started calling manifest destiny. This belief that American expansion across the continent wasn't just justified, it was inevitable. It was their destiny.
And the rest of the map just got filled in with incredible speed. First, Florida was purchased from Spain. Then, the independent Republic of Texas was annexed and brought into the Union. And then, after a really controversial and pretty consequential war with Mexico, the U.S. acquired the entire Southwest. We're talking everything from California to New Mexico. Every piece brought that transcontinental dream closer to being real.
So by the middle of the 1800s, the continental United States, as we know it today, was basically complete. That whole vision of manifest destiny, which was once just a dream, was now a geopolitical reality, written right there on the map. Now, after a brutal civil war settled the nation's internal conflicts over slavery and what it meant to be a single country, America's gaze started to turn outward. The age of expanding across the continent was over, but the age of global ambition, that was just getting started.
And the very first step in this new direction was buying Alaska from Russia in 1867. A lot of Americans at the time just mocked the deal. They called it Seward's Folly, this giant, worthless icebox. But the Russian negotiator who signed the papers, he knew he'd made a huge mistake. He knew he'd sold it way, way too cheaply. But the real turning point, the moment America stepped onto the world stage, came in 1898. A short, decisive war with a fading Spanish Empire completely changed the game. The U.S. went from being a regional player to a full-blown imperial power.
All of a sudden, the American flag was flying over islands all across the Caribbean, like Puerto Rico, and deep into the Pacific, with Guam and the Philippines. And Hawaii was annexed around the same time. The U.S. now had strategic naval bases thousands of miles from its own shores.
And the final piece of this global puzzle was the Panama Canal. This was an incredible feat of engineering, and what it did was give the U.S. Navy a massive shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This cemented America's status as a true two-ocean power. Now, it could project its military and its economic might pretty much anywhere on the globe.
And that right there, that leaves us with a huge question, doesn't it? What does a nation built on the idea of expansion do when it runs out of physical frontiers? That question would go on to define America's role in the 20th century and even today. The story of how America got its shape, well, it's a story that's still being written as the nation keeps figuring out its place in a really complex and always changing world.